So
I actually went in and stopped the Olympic rider clinic once, abusing a horse.
Now, I'm going to be a bit controversial here. You can get generational trauma in horses.
We've let horses down severely with the issue of castration and working or becoming athletic horses. A warm welcome back, and thank you all for your interest in and support of this topic, for liking, subscribing, commenting, and generally keeping this important issue alive and kicking. The landscape is definitely changing out there, and very rapidly, as many of you are talking freely about the ethics of horses in sport. The powers that be are definitely listening. Last week, we introduced this topic and provided a very detailed background. Tonight, we will cover even more background because, like any difficult subject, if you can familiarise yourself with the why, you can come up with ideas about the how. Together, we can make this happen. Once again, I'm delighted to welcome Anette Karlsson, advanced dressage rider from Sweden, who competes and trains under FEI rules, and who has a rather gifted daughter who, at only 17 years old, has just successfully entered the world of Grand Prix dressage. Bradley Whale from Ipotane Saddles, as well as being a registered human osteopath, he's also an equine osteopath and gifted saddle design and construction innovator. He comes from an engineering background and trained up to Olympic level in a range of different sports, including show jumping. He's also a clinical educator. He's a nerd of the highest order, but always follows up on his lines of inquiry with a highly applied, hands-on approach to his saddle design and his treatments. He has 3 children under 3, so we are hugely thankful to Mrs. Whale for single-handedly holding the nursery fort tonight for us. I'm a veterinary physiotherapist, graduate human sports therapist, certified saddle fitter and clinical educator, currently studying for a professional doctorate in the topic of rider posture, pain and performance, with a special focus on rider low back pain and lumbopelvic function for performance.
Next one is social pressure. And this is a bit of a bugbear, and this is something which has happened or going to happen if we're not seen to do anything. We have social pressure, which is put onto the equine industry externally. When there's a big event, social pressure forces the industry to change. And that has happened numerous times within the industry. For example, I can give you the British government and hunting. That change didn't happen within the industry. That happened because of social pressure externally. We had that with the Australian government and horse racing. So they now, if nobody knows, Australia has, I think it has now essentially banned jumping racing, and now particularly just encourages flat racing. We had the social pressure with modern pentathlon in the Olympics at Rio, I think it was. That was a huge amount of social pressure in order to change modern pentathlon. Again, didn't come from the industry, didn't come from within. It was a social pressure. It was external. Now, to open house, I used to do modern pentathlon many years ago. And I was a very good horse rider, and I found horse riding quite easy. But there were individuals who didn't know how to ride horses, but yet they were expected to just jump on horses and compete. Now, there had been numerous individuals like myself who would turn around and go, it is dangerous for the athlete, it is dangerous for the horse. And we had said that many years ago. And we're talking multiple decades ago. But it wasn't encouraged for change. The only time it changed was when there was a large event at a very well-recorded competition. And even then, the pressure came externally. It came from people who were not involved within the industry to go, this is not fair on horses. This is not fair on riders. Again, we had social pressure in British horse racing. And this is in particular event of a certain gentleman who was sat on the horse, an unfortunate horse which had died. That caused a huge amount of social uproar, which then elicited change. We've seen it again with social pressure and dressage. It's why we're here having this conversation. We're not here having this conversation because there was no event. We're having this conversation and doing this because there was an event, which is why we need to have these conversations, because it is external forces which are potentially going to come into our industry and force us to change.
How come these competitors don't learn how to ride when riding is involved?
What, in modern pentathlon?
Yeah, I think that's strange.
Okay, no, can I give you the honest answer for that?
Yes, yes.
So in modern pentathlon, if you can swim, I think it's 200 meter swim. If you can do that under 2 minutes, then you get over 1,000 points. If you run a certain distance, then you get over 1,000 points. In terms of the riding, if you go clear, you only get a fixed number of points. That's it.
Okay.
Whilst if you kind of drop a pole or you fall off or you're not within time, the proportional point loss is actually quite small.
Okay.
Whilst if you swim or shoot or do fencing or anything like that, or running, you get exponentially greater point value, if you see what I mean.
Yeah,
so
okay.
In terms of point structure in modern pentathlon, horse riding is actually one of the lowest scoring point systems within the sport of modern pentathlon.
Yeah. Maybe use a skateboard instead.
Well, this is the thing. I used to do modern pentathlon, so I could almost guarantee every single time I did modern pentathlon, I was going to get full points for modern in the horse riding phase. I was guaranteed to get it. But the thing was, I was also a fairly good shot, so I was good at shooting and I was good at fencing. So I had 3 out of the 5, which I was particularly good at. Swimming, I was very good at, but running, not me to sound rude, I'm too big. I'm built like a rhino, and I sound like a wheezing rhinoceros at the best of times. So me running, I could never score great points running because I'm not built for it. I'm not lean. I'm not a whippet or anything like that. So it was always down to points. But I used to get beaten by people who could run so quickly. They were just like gazelles.
Okay.
But they would get 2,000 points on their running, whilst I would only ever, in the horse riding, I would only ever be limited to 1,000 points. Like, even if I went clear and I got it within the time and I looked amazing and everything like that, no, that's just 1,000 points. That's it. That's all you're getting. So you get this kind of bias within modern pentathlon of, okay, what's the biggest point value you can use? So that's the reasons why. And they're now talking in modern pentathlon to removing horse riding and kind of using something else.
Yeah.
And they're exploring that.
Probably breakdancing.
Oh God, no. But this is,
breakdancing is good, but maybe not everybody's good.
Yeah. But this is why I say is that if you have external forces coming in and forcing change upon your industry, the problem is then they don't know your industry. They don't know the sport. So they're going to do things which they think the external partners or the external people think is healthy and good, but is actually detrimental for the industry.
Yeah.
And this is what we need to avoid. And this is why I'm a big advocate for going, okay, let's talk about this. Let's actually kind of implement kind of this, but this pull different approaches. Because you've got to start somewhere, and you can't start everywhere all at once because it's too much of a change for the industry. You've got to change 1 or 2 things, but it's got to be impactful, because otherwise, if you don't, then the external forces are going to come in and essentially lead to over-regulation, which will strangle and cripple the industry.
Yes, it does.
So, we have that as well. And we also, coincidentally, with external pressure, we also have social pressure internally as well, which is quite interesting. Like, social pressure internally is something which is much slower to evolve. whilst externally the pressure, like the social pressure for external, is quite quick, it's quite sharp. The internal pressure or social pressure which we get is much, much slower. So for example, consider how we used to back horses roughly 80 to 100 years ago. It was acceptable for us to take a horse, to tie it to a post, to tie up its leg, to then put a saddle on. That was acceptable 80 years ago. Now, that is horrendous. Now, imagine what the next 50 years are going to be, where we are now in 50 years' time. But again, that's 50 years. That's a long time. That's a generation. While social pressure in the UK, when we had the hunting ban put in, that happened very, very quickly. There was a lot of talk about a hunting ban going on in the UK, and then all of a sudden, within 6 months to a year, we had gone from literally having a conversation about it to legislation to implementation. That's the role and forces of the external. Internal, it's much, much slower, but it's also due to generations. There is a generational gap which occurs within the industry as well, or generational lag is the most polite way of describing it, which is quite fascinating. So something which Annette touched on last time we were talking, which is this generational lag. Annette, you certainly said it is last time, was that people come into the industry, they then step away from the industry, and then they come back into it.
Yes.
And
very common.
Yeah, it's really, really common, isn't it? One of the potential problems which can occur is you learn a certain method of riding or training, which is acceptable at the time, and then you come back to it. Let's just say you have 10 years away and then you come back. The industry may have moved on. We may have stepped away from certain training methods, but because you come back into it, you don't know that the industry has moved on, and you go back and start using older methods.
I actually had a 16-year lap.
Yeah.
I was breeding ponies in that gap, and I was occupied with dressage before that, and came back to it after that gap. And that was quite a shock, because roll gear was popular then. Coming from the old dressage to the new dressage, I can tell you I didn't like what I saw in that case.
Exactly, and that's what I mean, is that you then get conflict. You then get you get what we call generational conflict.
Yes.
And generational comparison. And it happens in both ways. So it happens from the negative learning. You know, I'm going to use a scenario. It was acceptable at the time to beat the horse and to do micro abuses and various things like that. You step away, you live a life, you go and work in the city or anything like that. You then come back, and you then step into that old methodology of using those training methods which you used to use. Now, that also happens in reverse, is that if you were trained really well and really eloquently and learned to listen to the horse and observe it, you step away and then you come back, and then the world which you've stepped into is abusing horses. You are then in conflict with everyone else around you. And it takes a hell of a lot of a strong character to then turn around and go, I'm not doing this. That is wrong. I'm not okay with this. And you inadvertently create kind of an isolation of yourself within the industry. So
I actually went in and stopped the Olympic rider clinic once, abusing a horse.
Yeah, that takes a huge amount of strength to do that. Now, this is the problem, is because we have massive generational differences going on within the industry. I try to explain this to people who are not involved within the industry, is that you go to any other sport where you have a huge number of people participating in the sport. When they are done with the sport, they leave and they do not come back. Now, equestrianism is unlike any other industry, is that we have a huge number of people involved with it at very young age. So they develop, they grow, they learn how to ride horses. They then step away and then they come back into it. And when they're coming back into it, they're then back into the industry for 10 years plus. So all of a sudden you have massive differences in opinions, in generational knowledge, in expertise. They then carry on and perpetuate it because their knowledge hasn't caught up. Now, this is a problem which we have within the industry, because people who come back in, they continue their old cycle of behavior. They continue their old cycle of how to train or belief systems. They haven't changed. But changing somebody's belief system is unbelievably difficult. So you have this problem within the industry. In any other sport, swimming, rowing, cycling, rugby, you have a certain demographic and a certain age bracket where you have greater influence over, and it's generally the younger generation. But in the equestrian, you are not just catering for the younger generation, you're also catering for the middle generation and also the older generation, because it is full spectrum. You have people in the industry which stretch the entire range. And that's why it becomes very difficult to target who first. So this is something which we have to be aware of, is this generational conflict which occurs, and generational comparison. You got to think, who is the trainer? The trainer is a potentially 50 or 60-year-old trainer which is training a 14-year-old. They have a certain mentality, the way they were kind of psychologically brought up, the generations which they, the experiences they had as a child are nowhere near in the same vein or comparison to a 14-year-old now. So you have this conflict of language, this conflict of training, there's so much which we need to talk about and have very open conversations. And conflict doesn't mean aggression. And I need to make that very clear, is that conflict is not aggression. It is just conflict. And I'm using the word conflict as a descriptive term of going difference. That is the reasons why I'm saying
I think also what I see as, I want to call it a problem, because
call it a problem.
People that have done something for a while and for a long while often comment, I've done this for a long while. I know how to do this. You are going to do the same.
Yes.
But time has nothing to do with how good you are at something. I can be worthless in riding, and I've ridden my entire life. I don't think that's relevant even.
Exactly.
I mean, you can be a beginner and not be good because you don't have had the time to learn. But I think it's overrated how long you've done something.
Yeah.
To be able to evaluate, I think that's quite key to all of this, is that you have to be knowledgeable enough, not just with the knowledge, but so that you can apply it and evaluate what you and others are doing and justify it.
Yeah. It's also why I'm a big advocate for people who want to get into the industry. You need to have almost like a little mini test, kind of like a driving test type thing, but for horses, and actually kind of go, right, sit down.
You really need that.
Exactly. That's what I mean, is you sit there and kind of go, right, how do you feed a horse? How do you turn a horse out? How do you do the basics? Because 10, 20 years ago, it was a different theory. It was a different idea. It was a thing. And then you take 10 years out, and then you come back and you have to reset the test, because things have changed, things have moved on. And the idea behind it is trying to give people the ability to have the most up-to-date information, but also then ultimately it's about protecting horses, because you sit there and
some
go,
kind of driver's license is needed.
Exactly, some kind of license. I'm not saying license as in serious,
No, but you need to know the basics.
You need to know the basics, because the basics may have changed, because there's research being done all the time, and we may kind of go, oh, actually, we shouldn't have been doing that all those years ago, and actually things have changed and moved on. And that's what I mean, is I'm a big advocate for something like that. Just a really basic test. It's just so that you hit some certain standards of welfare and care.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
then that is one way of getting around that and solving this issue of generational comparison or generational kind of differences which can occur, which is really important. Now, the next thing, if you're talking about generational comparison, then we need to talk about generational trauma. And that's a very big, heavy subject. So I'm going to try and be fairly light over this. But generational trauma is basically the passing on of emotion, psychological and biological impacts through into subsequent generations. You hit your horse and you do various things like that. That trauma then gets passed on to the children, and the children then assume that is normalized, so then they carry that on as well. Generational trauma is also for horses. Now, I'm going to be a bit controversial here. You can get generational trauma in horses because, for example, trauma can cause what we call changes to the genes, which is called an epigenetic tag. And which alter how genes are expressed. So it alters how genes actually work. If you have a lot of stress, then it causes the genes to function slightly differently within the mother or the father, which then means it passes on to the generation below.
Sorry, can I just clarify? Does that mean in how they are selected?
So, for example, I'm going to use human generational trauma as an example because it's easier to explain. The survivors of the Holocaust, their children, which they gave birth to after the Holocaust, they exhibited altered stress profiles. So what I mean by that is that they were more sensitive to stress. So much so that the rate of depression and anxiety and PTSD was over 70% higher in the offspring of Holocaust victims. Okay. Now, look at that in regards through the lens, slightly different in terms of horses. Now, what is the thing which we do to horses when they have trauma, when they have an injury? We then say, generally, right, you can't use it, we'll breed from it. It's done its deep digital flexor, or it's done its suspensory, go and breed from it. That means that that mother or father has been in a stressful environment and is now being used. So the body basically is evolving in a high stress environment. So that means that the offspring, and you've got to think how evolution works, is that the parents are saying, right, we're in a high stress environment. We want our children to be successful in the next generation in this similar environment, because that's all we've experienced. So all of a sudden, they pass that on, okay, to the next generation, saying genetically, prepare for an environment which is high stress. And that's why I always giggle when people say, oh, it's so and so breed of horse. Those horses are always like that. They always have a quirk. They always are da-da-da. And you go, that's passed on genetic trauma. That's not true. All horses are a little bit hot, you know, from that breed or that sire line or that mother line. Or she's always snappy. They're always a bit of a bitch. All of those types of personality profiles, and you're going, no, those are coping strategies by that horse, which is basically being passed on to the siblings, and that genetic trauma. You also notice genetic trauma and generational trauma in horses which have done their digital flexor, and then you start looking at the siblings, and they all start having deep digital flexor injuries. Sometimes not necessarily in the same environment. So you have physical complaints which reoccur. as well. And the other final thing for recognizing inherited trauma is illness, chronic illness. You not only get this in humans, okay, you also do get this in animals, and it has now been scientifically proven. And this is something which we have to address, because our methodology of training horses, if it is creating stress and you then want to breed from that horse, you are then basically passing on, and it is only a small factor, generational trauma, but it is of a consideration which we must have for the next generation. Which is why you start looking at horses which are now getting the regularity of injuries is exponentially increasing. And you have to sit back and go, why? Why are tendon injuries becoming more and more? Is it because of the arenas? Is it because of training methodologies? Is it because, and it's probably all of it, but it's all 1 or 2% every single piece. It's not, oh, it's all this or it's all that. It's kind of like, okay, it's 1% this, 1% that, 2% this, 2% that. It's all small bits, which, if you understand generational trauma and you start seeing it in horses, that then leads into the next question of how do we solve it?
Adding to that is the nature nurture. So, for example, if you take a traumatized mare who has been traumatized by her illnesses in her lifetime, not necessarily that she's had genetically passed on, but her behavioral issues, that's possibly why or how they can be passed on to the foal. So if she's still in pain, still stressed, maybe that's something to consider as well. We really need to have mentally healthy horses nurturing the foals, same as a mentally healthy human.
Well, this is where, for example, you start looking at horses as athletes, and you kind of go, right, the treatment of the horse in the early years has an exponentially bigger effect on the performance of the horse when it is older.
Yeah.
You know, we know that, both from a biomechanical perspective and a psychological perspective. But this is going to sound weird. Unlike humans, who, generally speaking, high performance individuals have similar childhood traumas and have similar psychological traits, horses don't do that. Horses, you know, there is collective trauma in horses because of how we breed them. You know, for example, we breed horses and we generally, horses and foals and mothers, they should be with each other for about 18 months to 2 years. We, certainly in Britain, generally take them off far too early. We take them off at 6 months, and that's quite common practice. So you do get this kind of childhood trauma-esque thing present in horses. But one thing which I see is that if you consider a horse that has been forced to perform at a high level at a young age, is that horse likely to perform at a high level later on in life? It is very unlikely, either biomechanically or psychologically.
Yeah.
Because it's like children. If you have a child and you push that child, which is a high performing child at an early age, in whatever sport, it doesn't matter if it's sport or education or anything, later on in life, you get burnout on a multiple different factors. So horses, but they can't burn out. We don't allow them to burn out. So what we do is we then basically give the horse a choice. And that choice is either resist and become difficult to perform, so become stubborn, or submit and shut down, which is the common terminology. And if the horse resists, what commonly occurs is that the horse is basically passed on. It's become difficult to train, so I'm going to get rid of it. It's too difficult. Sometimes without an explanation. So, you know, I'm just selling it because I need to. Actually going, well, no, it's really difficult to work with because it's jacked it in, or it's thanks. Yeah. Meaning that the next rider is potentially buying a horse that in his or her mind thinks, yep, I'm going to perform. It's going to be amazing, da 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 da. And actually, it's going to have to deal with an unknown psychological resistance. The horse is basically jacking it in. Or if the horse is shut down, the rider may use excessive methods to encourage the horse to work.
Yeah.
And which can ultimately lead to the lack of performance in biomechanics or psychological, which then means you've got to rehab.
Yeah.
And that then leads to a situation where humans, we have the ability to understand trauma. We get it. We understand everybody has trauma, some greater, some lesser. But we can go out and we can find the tools to correct that trauma. We can overcome it. But unlike a horse, which has trauma placed upon it, it doesn't go out and seek it or anything like that. It is then up to the rider to correct it. And that is the skill of rehabilitation.
Yeah.
True rehabilitation is not only addressing the biomechanics, the mental and the emotional. It is essentially being a therapist for the horse and trying to correct the horse in a very slow and methodical way. That to me is true rehabilitation.
Yes.
Unfortunately, rehabilitation has become performance driven.
Yeah.
You're looking at rehabilitation, and I see it all the time, where people are like, right, okay, I can solve your loading issue in a day. I can solve your bitting issue. I can solve your, and you're sat there going, yes, you can, but you're not actually looking at the deeper potential problems which are there. You're doing a quick fix. And that goes back to the society and the culture which we're in, is that we're looking again for that performance piece, where everything has to be a performance. I want to solve that issue. And in rehabilitation, I see this with humans all the time, is, and I'm just going on a segue, but where a human may have knee surgery and then wants to go through their rehab really quickly because they see it as a performance piece. It's like the body takes a certain amount of time to heal. You can't speed it up. You can't slow it down. The cells repair at a set speed. You know, you get a new set of blood cells every 120 days. You get a new set of platelets in your blood every 30 days. You can't speed it up. You can't slow it down. Just, it is what it is. Bones heal at a set speed. But people look at rehab as it's got to be done quickly. And the quicker I do it, the better I'm going to be. And you're sat there going, no. The same thing happens with rehab in horses, is you've got to work at the pace of the horse. You can't do these quick fixes because they never last.
And we are seeing more machines flooding into equine therapy, and that's fine, but they're getting into the hands of people who have very limited training. But it's, I must have this so that I can address that. Just a couple of points that I want to add to that there. This is completely fascinating, what you're saying. But young horses, if they develop a pain, they have no idea what that pain is, what the sensation is. So say a newly backed horse, let's say a horse that's been turned away 3 years, suddenly come into work. And then if they have an injury, they have no idea what pain is. And also the pain may be transient, that it's going to go away fairly soon. So that's traumatizing and difficult for them to deal with. But I'm going to bring in castration here, because although things are improving, we've let horses down severely with the issue of castration and working or becoming athletic horses. And it's particularly a problem with our imported entire horses. For the UK market, many of them are castrated at 6-7 years of age.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about that.
Annette, do you know a lot about castration? You must deal with your...
But it's not very common here to castrate that late.
Is it not?
No. It's
Wow.
more common as soon as possible.
Okay.
It's usually the Andalusian and those breeds that come into the country that's stallions still. But our own, we only say the horses that are good enough to show for improvement.
Yeah.
So it's not
Okay.
common here at all.
It's not common. Right. So castration.
You can almost not even sell a stallion if it's
Yeah.
1.5 years or 2 years old. It's not sellable even.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So in terms of castration, there's a couple of issues which occur because I'm going to be talking about male genitalia here. So please, if you're of a sensitive disposition, please be careful. So with horses, you've got the testes. Now, in horses, they can range in size quite a lot. They can become quite big, roughly the size of kind of mangoes, or a little bit bigger, and they can actually be quite small, the size of roughly a small orange. The way stallions move biomechanically is also slightly different. Because if you have a horse with fairly large testicles, when a horse or a stallion moves, it will not want to bash them. Okay. So what will happen is the horse will slightly change how the hind legs move. So it's very common to find stallions with stifle issues, partly because if they're quite well endowed in the testicular region, when they trot or move around, they don't want to hit them. So they kind of swing their legs a bit. It's also because with stallions, they do a lot of breeding and mounting. So obviously they're constantly putting the stifle and the hock, more the stifle, under greater load. Now, the difficulty is that if a horse which has been allowed to have testicles to a fairly large degree, and then they are removed, I'll get on to how they do the castration because it's slightly different, but suddenly you've got a change in gait which can occur.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing which we also have to say is that when you're looking at castration, so it's very important to understand how the horse is castrated.
Yeah.
In some cases, horses are given a general anesthetic, the horse is lying down, and the testicles are removed surgically. There are pros and cons with that. Pros are it's very easy to stitch up. Cons are sometimes can be quite difficult to get both testicles descending at the same time. One can migrate north and hide, and sometimes you have to fish it out. The also difficulty is when you stitch up, you do run a potential of stitching asymmetrically, and that's more common in people who are not used to doing castration, so that you can get a fascial pull where the testicles used to be. So in order to get around that, what some people do are standing castrations.
It's most common here.
Yeah. So the benefits of that are, for example, you're more likely to get both testicles descending. So you're almost guaranteed to get both testicles. But the difficulty is trying to stitch it back together becomes exponentially more difficult. Because the horse is under a local, it's standing, it is not under a general. So all of a sudden you're trying to stitch the area back, and you can get kind of more fascial involvement and fascial compensation, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So you do have that to deal with in terms of breeding and kind of various
also
issues.
Sorry, while they're lying down, the hind is flexed, hyperflexed, for say 15-20 minutes. And I've seen where geldings can then develop a short striding left hind because they're normally placed on their right side. So
because they're generally laying on their right, their left leg is, in the most polite way possible, strapped up and lifted up.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
kind of legs are most polite way possible. Legs akimbo, so your legs are separated to get easy access to it. And that,
I'll put
if
a
you're
picture
holding
in.
that position for a long period of time, you get
Yes.
muscular trauma and so on and so forth. And so you get various issues like that.
If they castrate a younger horse, the horse is then put away for several years, and when the horse comes back for training, the connection's not made between the horse has had surgery and there's a gait issue. So
you haven't got the development kind of issues going on as well, because essentially when it's a young horse, it's then turned out in the field and is allowed to move around and be free and so on and so forth. The horse which is slightly older, it is then generally put into a box. It was restrictive grazing or restrictive movement, and so on and so forth, because the site of the wound is reduced as well. Because if you think about it, if it's a foal or a young horse, they're not that big. When they're older, they're the size of mangoes. They're quite big. So the site of trauma is then also quite large. You do get issues going on in other things as well. So, for example, the relationship between the hormones and the testes, it does impact the quality of certain physiological processes going on within the body, because you're essentially removing an organ to give feedback to. Testosterone affects the testes. Testes then basically sends back hormonal signals to help control and regulate testosterone levels. Now, if you remove the testes, you've now removed that feedback loop. So all of a sudden, you've now got horses or foals which do not have any feedback loop of testosterone. So all of a sudden, testosterone levels kind of reduce and they become much more balanced, which is pro and con, because testosterone does a huge amount of things. It helps with muscle development, it helps with bone density growth, it helps with, there's a huge physiological process which testosterone does. Now, if you remove that kind of feedback loop, that will have knock-on effects and ramifications in terms of certain physiological processes within the horse. Pro and con. And this is where if you notice, every single time you're always trying to balance out, what's right for you, for the horse, for the industry, for so on and so forth. Like castration has a fairly large impact on horses' performance and horses generally.
And I always ask the question to my clients who've just acquired a horse from the continent, or even if they don't know about their horse's castration history, experience, if there was any complications at the time, even they just know very little about it. But I've had great success in improving gait by addressing scar tissue. So I just wanted to just bring up the topic generally of this major surgery that the sport horse may have had, particularly late comparatively in time. And it's something
what you've also got to remember, and this is something which I am just going to go back to, horse development and human development in comparison. I'm going to use this as a very loose comparison. Okay, so it's more as a way of just trying to put things into a little bit more perspective when we look at horses and humans. You imagine a human is fully mature by the age of 20, and you imagine a horse is fully mature by the age of 10. So if the human is aged 10, the equivalent age is the horse aged 5. Okay, so if you're going to have major surgery when the horse is 5 or 6, that is like major surgery for a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old. They remember it. It can be quite trauma-inducing. This is a very, very, very loose comparison, but it just helps to put things into a little bit more perspective when we're looking at training horses, the effect we have on horses in terms of the methodology of training, the environment which we put them in, even the food we give them, so on and so forth. for example, I've sat down with one client and I was like, right, use this comparison. Would you expect a 10-year-old human child to be able to perform complex gymnastics against comparable 12, 14, 16, 18-year-olds and be able to actually win? Because she was upset because her 5-year-old horse was competing against 6, 7, 8-year-olds and it wasn't performing the same. And you're like, okay, it doesn't work like that, because there's so much more development which occurs. A horse from a 5-year-old is mentally, physically, emotionally completely different to a 7-year-old. Like, Annette, dear God, you know that. It must be infuriating watching people trying to compete a 5-year-old and have exponentially high demands.
Yeah. Well, we do actually have some restrictions in the classes you can compete depending on the horse's age.
Yes, I forgot about that. Yeah.
So they really don't come across that age difference usually. You can compete a 5-year-old in easy classes with a 12-year-old, but that's not what we are thinking about here.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's fantastic, because that's the problem is you get competitions where people expect too much from their young horses.
7-year-old, you can go to a little bit higher classes, but the younger horses are fairly restricted here.
Massive thanks once again to Anette Karlsson and Bradley Whale for sharing your uniquely detailed insights. So much detail there of this critical topic, of which there's more. And thank you very much to the viewers who have survived this long. Have survived, persevered. Personally, I've just found it so highly engaging. So if you're with us, if you're still with us, thank you very much. And all comments are welcome. And we'll see you on the next one.
Yeah.
Good night.
Night.